Welcome to the Cyber Fusion Report, the show where we cut through cybersecurity noise and focus on what actually protects operations, infrastructure, and your business. This podcast is built around one core idea: cyber fusion. A cyber fusion center brings together IT security, operational technology, engineering insight, and human risk into a single coordinated defense strategy. So threats are detected earlier, response is faster, and operation stays running. Each episode, we sit down with security leaders, operators, and industry experts to unpack the real threats facing modern organizations, especially where cyber risk becomes operational risk. No hype, no theory, just practical insight on cyber resilience, operational continuity, and defending critical systems without disruption. If you're responsible for uptime, safety, or business continuity, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome to the Cyber Fusion Report, the podcast where we cut through cybersecurity noise and focus on what actually protects operations, infrastructure, and your business. I'm your host, Gary Mullen. Joining me again are the three Chris's, industry veterans who live this every day and bring decades of experience in securing critical infrastructure and industrial systems. Chris Wiley, FishCloud's Director of Operational Technologies, Cyber Fusion and Strategy. Chris Whiteman, Senior OT Threat Hunter at FishCloud. And Chris Mosley, OT Threat Detection Response Analyst for FishCloud. Most security strategies are built on what we believe is true. What's deployed, what's segmented, what's covered. Red teams don't test those beliefs. They break them. In today's episode of the Cyber Fusion Report, we're unpacking the red team findings that didn't just reveal gaps, they forced a change in defense strategy. The moments where dashboards said green, leadership felt confident, and attackers moved freely in the background. We'll look at what executives prioritize, what defenders see on the ground, and how real red team evidence closes those gaps, not with more tools or more reports, but with proof. If you've ever said, I thought we had that covered, this episode is for you. So let's dive in. Mr. Whiteman, you get the first question today. What red team finding most clearly proved from your experience in the past that something executives believed was covered was actually wide open, even though the report may have said otherwise?
Thanks again, Gary. It's always good sitting down. It's funny because we hear the term coverage a lot from our clients. Like, hey, are we covered? Right? We come in for assessments, we do all this stuff, and they want to know, like, how's our coverage? Are we good? And not just red team assessments, just general cybersecurity assessments. And very regularly, the response is going to be, do you know what you have? So if you don't know what you have, there's no way to, measure your coverage. Shadow IT or just forgotten IT is a real thing. Whether it has a business purpose or it no longer does, but it's still online, it's not included in your asset management or your cybersecurity protocols. So you're not really tracking it. And when I go back to these executives, or I'm talking to a cyber fusion center and they discuss coverage, I always reflect back on their asset management team and whether that's a separate function or that might be a part of the cyber fusion center. I think they're an integral, they're a bedrock of the cybersecurity foundation. Because you really don't know, if you don't know what you're protecting, you can't protect it. But even if you do have a good, solid asset management team, they still rely on some of these micrometrics in order to make any sort of declarative statement uh, to an executive. They can say things like, "We are confident that this tool is covering 90% of your assets, but we're also confident that you don't know about 5% of your assets. So we give this with a plus or minus 5% margin of error." That's a fair and equal declaration. I also have to mention that, like, these shadow assets or forgotten assets in IT, uh, they're a fantastic part of what we've discussed previously and on the line about the shadow currents. Those are amazing spots to gain access throughout a network. Um, and where red teaming assessments come into this, uh, we actually don't need your inventory, nor do we want it, because we're going to find it regardless. Um, and we love to find that shadow IT. It's not as a gotcha. It's not as a haha. We're super good at what we do. Um, but it reveals valuable and actionable remediations that you can make to improve the posture. So when I talk about coverage, really the most important thing is to know what you have, get rid of it, or cover it. And then you get more valuable or more value out of your tools. So that's kind of where I'm going with the tool value, and also, know what you have.
Hey, can I add something to that? Which
Please.
was Chris is sitting here, or Mr. Whiteman is sitting here, talking about um, the idea that you have these devices that sit in your environment that may have been never inventoried or just dropped off the inventory, or someone thought they were no longer valuable. Um, but originally, when they were put in place because they were necessary. So it was a route to get in or out, say, in terms of disaster recovery. But no one ever used it, and it's just sitting there in the background, and it's just been kind of forgotten. Or it was put in place during a disaster to be able to get around a broken system, and it was never actually properly inventoried. It wasn't part of change management, and therefore it kind of dropped off. Um, the average red team and the pen tester and the attacker have no idea really what's in your inventory, and they don't care. What they're doing is they're living inside of your environment, and they're saying what's available to me from what I can see. That means that whether or not you're looking at it, they are. And I think that's where Chris is trying to give you this concept that we we're living off of the land as we see it, not as the process has recorded it. Um, Generally speaking, we kind of laugh at the idea that uh, oh, there's a tool that might enumerate my system with the easy button. We're in there enumerating the environment anyway. Why aren't you taking that enumeration that the red teamers are giving you and adding that directly to your inventory so you have a better picture?
Well, Chris also mentioned remediation. And it's not about just finding vulnerabilities, but about making real changes in your environment that reduce business risk, right? So, Mr. Wiley, since you're talking, which red team result crossed the line from, oh, this is interesting, to, hey, we have to make a change here to defend our organization? And what finally made leadership listen to those change recommendations?
So I think a lot of us have directly lived this in the security community. you go ahead and you report findings, right? You have this entire massive report that's part of a deliverable that you have to give out, and it's full of findings. And leadership nods and they say, "Okay, we're going to make sure that this gets addressed." And it goes into a backlog, and then someone signs off and says that, "Yep, that's a risk." Nothing changes. And the reason that nothing changes was because the finding was described and not demonstrated. In fact, often I would say that when I have dealt with clients, it isn't uncommon for clients to say, well, sure, but unless you can show me directly that this happens, right? You say you can do a middleman on an MFA. Well, until you describe it to me and show it to me that it's possible, it's not. So one of the clearest examples I can point to involves like Active Directory Certificate Services, ADCS. There's a fantastic paper from SpectreOps called Certified Pre-Owned. That really laid this out for the industry, and the specific misconfigurations we're talking about are ESC1 and ESC4. These are escalation paths within your certificate infrastructure that most organizations don't even know exist, let alone monitor. What makes this so impactful is that during a red team engagement, these particular misconfigurations are quiet. There's no malware, there's no exploit code triggering endpoint detection. You're essentially abusing legitimate features of the environment. You're requesting certificates, you're enrolling in templates. And the result is that you can impersonate any user in the domain, including domain admins. You can achieve full domain compromise without ever touching a vulnerability scanner's radar. Now, here's where it crosses from interesting finding to we need to rethink our defense strategy. When we walked leadership through exactly what we did, step by step, and showed them that we went from a standard user account to domain admin using nothing but their own certificate infrastructure, and that none of their detection tools flagged a single thing, that was the moment that the room got quiet. It wasn't a theoretical risk anymore. It was proof that an attacker could own their environment using a path that no dashboard, no vulnerability scan, and no compliance audit had ever surfaced. And what made leadership really listen, not a severity rating on a spreadsheet, but an actual live demonstration that we could access their crown jewels and nobody could see it or detect it. That strategic shift makes it really significant. It wasn't just patch this template or fix this permission. It was a fundamental reevaluation of how they managed identity, how they monitored certificate activity, and honestly forced a broader conversation about what their detection strategy was actually aligned to catch versus what attackers are actually doing.
So let's dive into that just a little bit deeper. We talk about these hidden paths. We like to refer to them as shadow currents within the organization, and many of them are even trusted paths that you wouldn't expect to show up on a dashboard, right? Mr. Whiteman, what do red teams consistently expose in organizations that executive dashboards or maturity score sheets never capture?
Um, another great question. So executive dashboards in particular, a little bit of a different animal. They're typically just fed from operational dashboards, or they use the same data set that an operational dashboard is going to use. But if that data set doesn't actually exist, neither one of them are going to see it. So in response, I would say one of the things that red teams consistently assess is access management. And that's something that I have rarely, if ever, seen on a dashboard. They can tell you about your posture, like how many vulnerabilities you have open, where your remediation percentage is on those vulnerabilities. they're not going to tell you who's allowed to access what information or resources. Um, so when we conduct an assessment, we're essentially behaving like an attacker that doesn't want to be found. So we quietly walk through an environment to get an understanding of what we can access. Um, and even though, initially an attacker would try to get persistence first and then privilege escalation, we don't do that we typically don't do that in our assessments. But the next thing you're going to do is discovery, and you're going to find out, you're going to try to find out as much information of the environment you currently exist in as quickly as possible. So if there aren't these access management controls on things, the attacker is going to get a lot of good information. Um, Most organizations, especially those that aren't moving towards a zero trust architecture, they don't have governance, processes, protocols. They don't assess or evaluate, who can access what information and what resources on the network. It's kind of like trust first, which has been the common and historical approach. So there are notoriously loose controls on data archives like file shares or SharePoint or the Teams chats or Teams, which is SharePoint, of course, in the back end, but typically not locked down. Um, and there aren't dashboards developed. I've never seen one that tells you who's allowed to access that information. We had one client that essentially had little or no controls on their SharePoint. So we were able to go in there and essentially scrape all their architectural designs, cybersecurity, vulnerability, HR, and proprietary information without detection. And we're also able to exfiltrate it without detection. So when you think about a ransomware or an extortion scenario, how dangerous that can be. So I think returning back to dashboards, they're informative, they're pretty. But if you aren't actually auditing and paying specific attention to the flow and the paths that people can take and what information is accessible, uh, the dashboards give you very limited information and also false security into what you think your posture is from an executive standpoint. So the risks around default cloud identity access management, that's even scarier, but I'll save that for maybe a different episode.
Okay, great. You mentioned SharePoint, right, as a significant risk within an organization because they'd put no real controls around who could access SharePoint, access the data within SharePoint, and many organizations, you know, funnel a great deal of data through a SharePoint instance. And there's some real danger there. Chris Mosley, um, looking at identifying that danger and actually getting executives to do something about it, right? To implement the controls that are necessary. Can you describe a moment where you've seen analysts actually identified an immediate threat, such as the one that Mr. Whiteman talked about, but leadership considered it an acceptable risk and weren't prepared to do anything about it? And how do you close that gap?
That's a great question. I don't know if you saw, but Whiteman and Wiley were both kind of chuckling to themselves because I think they knew where I'm going with this. At our previous one of our previous jobs that we worked with, uh, we were monitoring the OT network and we saw some very very suspicious traffic coming from you know Kali Linux, which is not something you want running in your environment at all. And we brought it up to leadership and to the powers that be, and everybody was like, "That's this one guy's job, and it's how he's always done it, and we're not going to change it." We tried talking to him and educating him on, "Hey, not sure if you're aware, this is not good, and we're trying to figure out what's going on." And he kind of told us to pound sand, and that we shouldn't tell him how to do his job, and he knew what he was doing. And so the conclusion to that was highly suspicious traffic in the OT network that is sending off massive red flags, sending off tons and tons of alerts. Um, and we like there was literally zero we could do about it.
It
Um,
just stayed there. And they literally just said, "Yep, that's a risk."
and this same guy would do tons of things like he would run nmap every week, which would cause problems of it had been done so much that any of the OT equipment that would have been broken by running nmap was already broken, so there weren't any alerts of something not functioning properly. Um,
OT side, but also on the defense analyst side, if I may, Chris, on the defensive side, those alerts are still coming in. So the analysts have an obligation to address those alerts. And this is a justified function that is causing more work that you don't want to whitelist this activity, right?
So
You
funny
can't
enough,
white
that is exactly what the operator asked was, "Can't you just whitelist my machine so
whitelist
it never shows
Metasploit.
up on any report?" And w we were like, "Wait a minute. If we whitelist you and something bad does happen, not that we could tell the difference when you're running a malicious tool set on your machine, but if something were to happen, we would immediately let it go by. This would be the ultimate target if you're an attacker or a red teamer. Take this machine. Hey, it's already got all your tool set installed. Everyone's going to ignore it anyways. Here we go."
Yeah, that's a great example.
yeah, so that just as the main example there, and your question was how do we close the gap? Um, and a lot of it was just trying to educate kind of everybody involved, both the operator doing the we'll call it incorrect work, and the leadership involved, and like his direct supervisor and our supervisors, just educating everybody. Hey, this traffic is bad. Here's why it's bad. Um, and here's what it could be doing. Unfortunately, in our case, nothing was really done about it, but in an ideal scenario, people would look at that. Here's the risk. Here's the problem. Let's mitigate the problem. But
It's from what Mosley's saying, and then from my own belief said. I mean, it's a cultural paradigm shift that has to take place, and we haven't seen it yet.
Worked with a gentleman in the past, and this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. He said to me with a straight face, "I will keep an open mind, but I will not change it." And that seems to be the mindset that you're talking about here. So, Mr. Wiley, to carry on with that, um, based on red teaming you've done, what kind of evidence actually changes internal behavior, not just the controls, but changes internal behavior of the people making the decisions as to what needs to happen?
I would say that changing behaviors is gives you the most lasting impact. Now, so what causes those changes? Um, I don't know. I would say that we spend an awful lot of time in cybersecurity focused on tools. I know that every time I go into a new environment, they turn around and they say, "Oh, we've got this thing you have to learn. Um, it's going to take you 2 or 3 weeks to go ahead and learn this tool." And I look at it and go, "Does it look at logs?" Well, good. Logs. Those are logs and logs are logs. Good. Um, is it a SIM? Yeah. Okay. Good. I've dealt with a number of SIMs. So I understand the theory, the tool is kind of useless. But as Mosey was pointing out, the real vulnerabilities in most organizations are cultural. Who owns what? Who escalates to whom? Who's empowered to make a decision when something goes wrong? What we've seen consistently is that red team results land on the table, real, undeniable evidence. We were just talking about the fact that I demonstrated an attack and suddenly people go, "Oh, I'm going to change my mind." So we have evidence that an attacker can move through an environment, or after something has happened, we have evidence that an attacker has done this thing, right? So if you bring in threat hunt and they detect something, and that forces a reckoning with leadership beyond the, hey, we need a new tool or we need to update a firewall rule. If you've actually had a compromise in your environment, someone doesn't go, "Ooh, now let me install Splunk." What they actually do is ask the harder question, like, who was in charge of this? Why didn't anyone own this gap? Why did this sit in a gray area between the IT and security for 6 months in a vulnerability checklist that someone had signed off on the risk? Why did the SOC see something anomalous and not escalate it? We quite literally did a red teaming assessment recently where we had already gained access. The SOC reached out to us and said, "Hey, are you allowed to be doing this?" And in a chief moment of social engineering, we said, "Yes, just call this gentleman." We knew his name. And they said, "Okay," and never escalated to check with the security officer involved whether or not we were even associated. They just
Yeah.
didn't even bother to report it. We've seen engagements where red team findings fundamentally change how teams communicate. So before the assessment, you had security, IT operations, and businesses all operating in their own lanes. Security would flag a risk. IT would say, "Not my priority." Business would say that they would need a system running as is. You can't afford to affect production. No one actually ends up owning the risk involved. It just floats in the middle. After seeing a red team walk through that gap, right, where you've already been exposed, through the exact same, I don't know, we'll call it a chasm between different teams, right? Those silos, right? Then after getting that red team walkthrough, you get the organization standing up and looking at some level of cross-functional risk in their ownership model. They start having regular tabletop exercises where security, IT, and business leadership, your BIZOs, all sit in the same room and walk through a scenario together. And you get to see those pregnant pauses where someone says, "What would you do now?" And there's silence. "Oh, we have a playbook for that." "Do you have it available now? Show me the playbook. What would you do?" Because you should already know, or at least be able to access it immediately so that your frontline defenders can act without waiting for 3 levels of approval. Another thing we see is a shift after those red team assessments in how people think about accountability. I mean, if it's who owned this gap and the next thing is someone gets fired, obviously a level of accountability becomes important. So before a red team engagement, there's this culture of, "Well, I submitted a ticket," or, "Well, we flagged it in the report," but after the engagement, we show that the tickets and the reports didn't prevent the compromise. It's a piece of paper. What does it do to prevent anything? The conversation shifts to being about outcomes. It's no longer about whether or not you documented the risk. It's about whether or not that risk got addressed. Did it get remediated, like Mr. Whiteman was saying? And honestly, that's the cultural shift that matters most. The biggest fix is almost never about a new piece of technology. It's getting the right people in the room, giving them clear ownership, and creating an environment where escalation isn't seen as blame. It's seen as making the system work the way it should.
So then let's go ahead, Chris.
Sorry if I could jump in. I was hoping you would use that word. The typical culture has always been, oh, they're gonna blame me, rather than flipping around and being like, I have an opportunity to improve. Right? Oh, you pointed this out, I wasn't aware, so now I'll be better. And it's just it is, a change in the paradigm of how ownership of certain functions, the owners of the certain functions approach assessments. It's not criticism. We do this to help you improve. So it's the blame game needs to go away. It's not blame. It's
I would
for the
also say I would say it's that leading from in front mentality also, rather than following from behind. A leader gets out there up front and says, okay, what can we do to make the organization better? How can I go ahead and improve the security of my environment so that I don't have to worry about $850 million in losses when my production line goes, right? The follower is like, well, hey, that's not my fault. Doesn't mean that they don't get, fired later anyways, right? But at least if you tried, you can point to, these were all the remediation steps I took to make sure this didn't happen.
For those of you listening, he didn't mean that you're going to get fired anytime soon. But you did mention leadership, Mr. Wiley, and let's kind of wrap this up with kind of where the rubber meets the road for leadership. If executives could learn one thing from the outcomes of a real red team assessment, what should they stop measuring and what should replace it?
All right. So if I could sit down with every executive who's responsible for cybersecurity investment and tell them one thing, it would be this: stop measuring compliance and start measuring consequence. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that compliance doesn't matter. You need it. Regulatory requirements are real. You should meet them. But compliance has become a proxy for security in way too many organizations, and it's a dangerous substitution. Passing an audit tells you that you set a minimum number of requirements in place and you were compliant to 80% or 90% at a single point in time. It doesn't tell you whether an attacker can move laterally through your network, escalate privileges, access your most sensitive data, and exfiltrate it without anyone noticing. What executives should measure instead is operational resilience. And I mean real tested resilience, not have we had an incident, but we executed our incident response plan against a simulated attack, and here's what worked, here's what broke, and here's what we're fixing. Not we have 85% endpoint coverage, but an attacker attempted a lateral movement and we caught it on detection. We did it in under 4 minutes, and our response time was able to contain that lateral movement in under 15 minutes and remediate. The metrics that actually matter are things like time to detect an intrusion, time to contain the intrusion, the percentage of attack paths in your environment that are actually monitored versus the ones that are blind spots. And you should understand that you will have blind spots, but maybe that you have segmented off those blind spots because you can't detect inside of them, you can detect access to and from them. How many of your critical assets can be reached from a compromised standard user account? So if an account was compromised, what could that account reach? Hopefully just that account's assets. not, as Mr. Whiteman pointed out, an unmitigated SharePoint where all documents are available to the world. Those are consequence-based metrics. They tell you what happens when something goes wrong, not just what your posture looks like on a good day. And here's the part that drives this home. Every red team engagement we do generates data that could populate these kinds of metrics. The problem is that most organizations take that data and they file it down as a one-time report so that they are compliant with their pen testing requirement. And instead of using it to build an ongoing measurement framework, it just becomes another checkbox. So my message to executives is this: red teams are not just a test. They're a measurement tool. Use them that way. Measure twice, cut once. Build your security metrics around what attackers can actually achieve, and you'll make decisions that genuinely reduce risk. Keep measuring compliance checkboxes and maturity scores in isolation, and you'll keep feeling secure right up until the moment that you are proven to be not secure. Because at the end of the day, what you choose to measure shapes every decision downstream, and it determines what gets funded, what gets prioritized, and ultimately whether you detect a real threat or just have a compliance checkbox that moves through your environment.
You said something very key there at the beginning of that answer, and it's a statement that we need to reiterate to the listeners here. And that statement is: stop measuring compliance and start measuring consequence, because that is how you're going to actually begin to put in the procedures, processes, and tool sets that actually help you mitigate risk within your environment. As we
I'm
wrap
glad you
up,
caught that one.
yeah, I did. As we wrap up today, I'd like to thank the three Chris's once again for opening our eyes to the critical nature of red team assessments and what's at risk if you aren't doing them. Here's the uncomfortable truth: most breaches don't happen because teams ignored risk. They happen because risk was never demonstrated clearly enough to act on it. If you can't see it, you can't defend against it. Red teams don't exist to embarrass defenders or challenge leadership. They exist to replace assumptions with evidence, and evidence is what changes your strategy. The organizations that improve fastest aren't the ones that have the best dashboards or the highest maturity scores. They're the ones willing to confront what red teams actually show them and realign decisions, ownership, and response around that changed reality. If this conversation challenged how you think about testing, validation, or confidence in your overall defenses, well, that's the point. Because resilience isn't something you declare, it's something you prove. Thanks for listening to the Cyber Fusion Report. This has been the Cyber Fusion Report podcast. Thanks for joining us, and for more information, please visit www.fishcloud.com or email us at cfc@fishcloud.com. Thanks, and have a great day.